I'm speaking on behalf of all three of us. So Ian Beavis from the Tunbridge Wells Museum and Art Gallery, Anne Logan and myself are working on behalf of the University of Kent. We decided we wouldn't do the Punch and Judy show, so but Anne and Ian will be helping to field questions afterwards. So I'm going to start with a quote. I found myself magically transported to 100 years ago, into the minds and lives of women, most of whom lacked the advantages we enjoy today. So said Alison Bailey, who was a visitor to the Tunbridge Wells Borough Museum and Art Gallery in January 2013, after viewing on the first day the museum's new exhibition entitled Inspiring Women, Hidden Histories from West Kent. And this opening marked the culmination of a 10-month-long collaborative project between the museum and the University of Kent, which was funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. So our project aimed to uncover the hidden histories of women in Tunbridge Wells and the surrounding areas in the early years of the 20th century. So we brought together for the very first time artefacts and images. So some of these have been previously unseen, from the Women's Library, the National Archives, the Museum of London, the Mary Evans Picture Library, as well from private sources and the museum's own collections. And these were mounted in a temporary physical exhibition, which we've got some pictures of, which is now closed, but also a more permanent exhibition online to disseminate findings of historical research beyond the academy to the general public, and particularly to students. This was something that was very interesting to us, very important, and to teachers. And the project thus aimed to have impact by increasing knowledge and understanding of local and national history in the West Kent and East Sussex area. So one of our project's starting points had been the discovery of a rich and very vibrant local history of women's political and social welfare activism in the early 20th century, with the previous talk there as well. In a town usually better known for its staid conservatism, this discovery had initially been surprising and intriguing. And an additional significant development was the donation to the Women's Library some years previously of the personal papers and effects of Amelia Scott, photographed in the centre there, who was a poor law guardian, the first woman member of the Tunbridge Wells Town Council, and a very energetic social and political activist. And this collection, we've got some examples here, was previously stored in a family garage, and this provided a gateway to the academic research dimension of the project, which Anne and I were responsible for, as the means of uncovering the part played by Scott and her fellow workers in the town's history. It had already been the subject of some published research, but the impetus to carry this a stage further and widen its scope was matched by the museum's own mission statement, a commitment to, quote, documenting the life of sections of the community whose story may be underrepresented by traditional history, and to promoting research and understanding of untold stories, new ways of telling familiar stories, and new configurations of known data. With funding secured under the AHRC's Knowledge Transfer Fellowship scheme then, our new project was underway. So in brief, the exhibition told the story of a town with an unusual social demographic profile. So a town with a 59% female population in 1901, was rather unusual. So there were many all-female households comprising widowed and never married women, both those of private means and those economically active, and high levels of domestic servant keeping. This demographic had significant implications for the social, philanthropic and political life of the town. Large numbers of women with social capital were active in a very wide range of voluntary and philanthropic organisations. So, for example, the town was home to an exceptionally active branch of the National Union of Women Workers, which was to survive for 89 years. And these same women, these activists, were well placed then to respond to the tumultuous events of the first quarter of the 20th century. They turned with energy to the question of women's suffrage, for example. A meeting had been held in Tunbridge Wells as early as 1873, and a branch of the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies was formed in 1906. Both militant and non-militant branches of women's suffrage movement were represented in the town, and their activities reflect the broad spectrum of constitutional and militant strategies, as illustrated by a number of the images here. So posters, original photograph, etc. So the constitutional NUWSS, the town's largest and most active suffrage organisation, took part in the National Pilgrimage in 1913. And this was a mass march to London, organisation or branches from all over the country, all a mass march and convening in central London. But more notoriously, including events such as the interruption of a home county's Liberal Federation meeting held in the Tunbridge Wells Opera House, in which Emily Wilding Davidson took part some 3 months prior to her death, and the burning of the local cricket pavilion in the same year at the height of the militant arson campaign. At the outbreak of the First World War, organisational skills honed in the pursuit of political goals and philanthropic social work were then turned to the war effort, although some suffragists did turn progressively towards pacifism and the amelioration of its human impact. The NUWSS and the Women's Social and Political Union called a halt to political agitation, and a notice was placed in the window of the local NUWSS premises to the effect that all political and propaganda work is suspended. So for the duration of the war, the premises were used as a depot for donations of clothing, and in addition to nursing, other local initiatives included work with Belgian refugees, running canteens and clubs for soldiers' wives, and the organisation of women's voluntary patrols to befriend the town's young girls and young women from the perceived dangers of so-called khaki fever and the encamped troops. And more unusually, the local branch of the National Council of Women set up a laundry where soldiers' clothing and uniforms were washed and mended. In the aftermath of war, Tunbridge Wells women again had very prominent roles to play. Amelia Scott, who we've already heard about, and Susan Power were the first two women to be elected to the Borough Council in 1919 by an electorate that included women for the first time. And they used their positions to bring maternity and child welfare issues to the attention of the public. So really, they were using their newfound responsibilities in the interests of other women. A hostel and day nursery for children and provision for the mothers of illegitimate infants. Other post-war reconstruction initiatives, such as housing for the elderly, got underway, and soup kitchens were funded by public donation to ensure that children were properly fed during the winter. Further from home, donations were sent to Russia to support the efforts of volunteers with the Save the Children Front. And what was interesting in researching this history and putting these narratives together, experiences and contributions of many individual women and families were uncovered. And we tried to give prominent place to these reconstructive biographies as a way of using their stories to illustrate broader themes and demonstrate the human impact of wider political events. And so hopefully if the visitor Alison Bailey, with whose recollections we started, are in any way typical, she felt transported into the lives and minds of women 100 years previously, then the exhibition could be considered to have succeeded in demonstrating human impact. The plan to narrate these complex stories through an exhibition of text, 2D illustrations and 3D objects inevitably posed both practical problems of the type that we've already heard about and of the type less often encountered by academic historians, and methodological challenges. On the practical front, the timing of the Borough Council's scheme to install a lift into the museum building proved to be both a curse and a blessing. The opening date of the physical exhibition was delayed, buying more research time, but necessitating a midwinter launch date and some additional Research Council paperwork, but also meant that the exhibition was given an extended run. More challengingly, the uncertainties surrounding the future of the Women's Library collections during 2012 and the financial constraints that we've heard about already this morning, in the light of imminent closure of its home in Whitechapel, meant the withdrawal of a previously agreed loan arrangement relating to artefacts and original images from the Amelia Scott collection and their replacement with digital reproductions. So doing what you always have to do in an attempt to turn this very considerable disappointment into a positive, alternative display methods were brought into play, but these did enable, for example, all the pages of a presentation album to be displayed in a perpetual digital slideshow, whereas had we been displaying the physical album, they would have been in a case open only at one page. So we tried to turn that to a positive. The research dimensions of the project required a mix of methodologies, some of which are most frequently used outside of the academy. So appeals were made in the local press and through local history societies. Family members and descendants of interesting individuals were identified, and requests made for information and/or display items. So we've got some photographs donated by family members and artefacts as well. This approach was facilitated by newly available digital resources. Again, we've heard about that already this morning, which made possible research that would have posed a considerable challenge, if not have been completely impossible, even 10 years previously. It also optimised the many benefits of the collaboration, amongst which were the ability to contextualise known local evidence and materials with loaned materials from national repositories and additional research. Methodologically, despite the shared objectives of academics and the museum, the collaborative work exposed differences in disciplinary approaches and posed additional challenges. The first of these, which I'm sure most of us know about, the need to reduce complex and nuanced stories to relatively simple narratives and to enable artefacts and images to speak for themselves. Ordinarily, the approach of academic history is to resist oversimplification in favour of nuanced, balanced and multi-causal interpretations of the past. In contrast, as Hooper and Greenhill has recently observed, the power of display as a method of communication lies in its capacity to produce visual narratives that are apparently harmonious, unified and complete. For the academic historian, interpretations of the past are rarely harmonious, never unified nor complete. Furthermore, for the historian, written text, be it manuscript or print, is usually both the point of departure for research and the medium of its delivery. Most often, where historians work with three-dimensional objects, they use material culture in an object-driven way as a starting point from which to explore context in pursuit of an understanding of the people and cultures that made or used them. This disciplinary way of working had to be modified to conform more closely to the conventions of display, since, as Bell observes, museum displays are best understood as processes formed by the dynamic interactions of people with the objects. And thus working methods were adapted to accommodate museological approaches that place the object centrally as the bearer of information, with textual panels providing the minimum introductory context. So, for example, the biographies of many more of our interesting women had to be discarded or omitted on the basis that we didn't have photographs or artefacts, and we could have only told their stories through text. However, the accompanying online 2D exhibition, which visitors to the physical space were encouraged to continue their visit virtually, went some way to address this dilemma, as did an associated programme of live events and talks. So with the website, the choice of pathways we were offered allowed the visitors to engage with the text and the stories at a level and at a speed that they could determine by themselves. And it also allowed perusal of the two-dimensional images and photographs of the artefacts and objects in close-up as a means of introducing a student and general public audience to the basic skills of primary source analysis, but in a very accessible and user-friendly way. And likewise, the programme of associated talks, activities for young people, and a guided walk, led by Anne, achieved impact through community engagement. So by way of conclusion, we're borrowing a fashionable buzzword to consider the legacy of the collaboration. Undoubtedly, the exhibition energised existing local interest in local history and arguably inspired new appreciation of a hitherto little-known aspect of Tunbridge Wells history. This is reflected in the decision by the Southborough Society to recognise Amelia Scott and specifically her, quote, contribution to the working women and girls of Tunbridge Wells by erecting a memorial plaque at her former home. It's also reflected in the fact that this was the best attended unveiling ceremony, again carried out by Anne, in the Society's history. And likewise, when the local civic society began to plan a centenary First World War publication, a chapter was dedicated to the contribution of and impact on women, and we were invited to write the chapter. Publication is due next week.
Mm-hmm.
From the museum's perspective, the project has helped to open up a new way of approaching the story of Tunbridge Wells, which has often in the past been presented as a narrative centred on the great and the good, from which the stories of the working class people, the poor and women have largely been omitted. It's hoped that further academic collaboration may be possible in the future, with the inspiring women's story forming part of a wider new social history for Tunbridge Wells. The project and its wider implications are already shaping plans for the heritage story in Tunbridge Wells' projected cultural and learning hub, a concept currently in its very early stages. It's envisaged that the museum displays in such a development would demonstrate that although popularly known as the embodiment of Middle England and the home of Disgusted, the real history of Tunbridge Wells is much more interesting and unexpected, an unpredictable tale of change and transformation, including how the town became a centre for radical thinking on issues like the rights of women. More immediately, the Inspiring Women project has encouraged further academic collaboration with the University of Kent's History of Medicine department, with postgraduate students researching content for the current exhibition Back to Blighty, which tells the story of Tunbridge Wells as a place of healing during the First World War. Our collaborative project was therefore successful in rediscovering both existing collections but also communities and hopefully making connections between them. Thank you.